Jalen Carter had always been the type of kid who did things the right way. At 17, he divided his time between high school classes, after-school basketball practice, and extra shifts at a downtown Riverton cafe. He worked hard for every dollar he earned, always saving a special portion to gift his younger sister, Aaliyah, who was about to turn 10 that week. Aaliyah was the kind of girl who saw magic in little things, and Jalen couldn't get the image of her smiling as she received the perfect gift out of his head. A silver bracelet adorned with various charms, carefully showcased in the gleaming window of Belmont Jewelers. After months of saving, Jalen finally had the money in hand and, on that sunny Saturday afternoon, walked confidently toward the jewelry store, his steps firm and a proud smile on his face. As he pushed open the store's crystal-clear glass doors, Jalen felt the icy blast of the air conditioning hit his brown skin, causing the fine hairs on his arms to stand up slightly. The environment was elegant and quiet, with walls painted in light tones and counters reflecting the impeccable shine of the displayed jewels. Behind the main counter, Margaret Whitmore watched intently as she adjusted her fake pearls, hanging on an immaculately pressed white blouse. Margaret had short, fine blonde hair, golden glasses perched on the tip of her nose, and a permanently suspicious expression, as if she were always one step away from uncovering something wrong. When Jalen entered, her gaze immediately fixed on him, following his every move with a mixture of surprise and silent judgment, as if the presence of that young man in a grey t-shirt and black hoodie was profoundly out of place in that sophisticated establishment. Jalen was no stranger to suspicion. He was used to wary looks in stores and malls, but that day, the sensation felt particularly uncomfortable. Perhaps it was the significance of the gift or the anticipation built up after months of hard work. As he walked slowly along the shiny, polished floor toward the counter, he felt Margaret's piercing eyes following him, as if scrutinizing every detail of his appearance. He tried to ignore that heavy energy and, with the impeccable manners he had learned at home, smiled and calmly said, "Good afternoon. I'd like to see that silver bracelet in the window, please." His voice was firm, yet soft enough to convey respect. Even so, Margaret frowned, adjusted her golden glasses, and retorted in a tone clearly laden with doubt, "You do know that item is quite expensive, don't you?" Those words, although spoken with an artificial smile on Margaret's thin, tight lips, carried more weight than they seemed at first glance. Jalen felt a knot tighten in his stomach, but he did not let it shake him. Calmly, he pulled from the pocket of his black hoodie a neatly folded bundle of bills that he had proudly saved for weeks. He slowly unfolded the money before Margaret's incredulous eyes, making it clear that he knew exactly what he was doing there. "Yes, I know the price. I worked really hard to put this together," he replied with determination and composure. However, Margaret, instead of accepting his answer, pursed her thin lips even further, looking at him with an expression that seemed to try to decipher some hidden lie. After an awkward silence, she sighed deeply, as if doing him a great favor, then picked up the bracelet from the window with exaggerated slowness and placed it on the counter, letting it gleam under the store's golden lights. "Be careful," she warned in an unnecessarily harsh tone. "This piece is worth more than you imagine." Jalen felt a pang of indignation grow inside him, but he took a deep breath, recalling his mother's teachings about patience and self-control. While Jalen carefully admired the shimmering bracelet under the warm lights of the store, he began to imagine his sister's illuminated face when she received that special gift. The bracelet was delicate, decorated with small silver charms that seemed to tell their own stories: a star, a flower, a heart. Each symbolized something unique for Aaliyah, and he smiled softly, lost in that brief moment of anticipated happiness. However, perhaps because he was anxious or due to the constant pressure of Margaret's cold gaze on him, his fingers slipped, causing the bracelet to fall to the polished floor with a soft, metallic clink. His heart stopped for a moment, and he immediately bent down to retrieve the piece, already preparing to offer sincere apologies. Before he could even pick up the jewel, however, he heard a shrill cry echo through the store. "I knew you were up to something." Margaret was dramatically pointing at Jaylen, her loud, alarmed voice reverberating off the bright walls of the store. Customers who had been calmly strolling among the shiny counters instantly stopped, their wide eyes turning toward him. Jaylen quickly stood up, holding the bracelet in his open palm, trying to explain that it had all been a simple accident. But Margaret didn't seem interested in hearing him. She had already decided to blame him. Without giving him room for explanations, she ran to the back of the counter and, in a frantic gesture, grabbed the phone with trembling fingers. Within seconds, her sharp voice filled the awkward silence of the jewelry store as she reported to the police an exaggerated and completely distorted version of the incident. "An aggressive black young man is trying to steal a very expensive bracelet from my store. He's wearing a black hoodie. Please come quickly." The accusation, spoken loudly and clearly, struck Jaylen like a physical blow, making his legs tremble as a cold wave of panic overtook his entire body. Sirens began to echo in the distance, like a sinister warning rapidly approaching. Inside the jewelry store, the silence was suffocating, heavy, charged with tension and accusing stares. Jaylen felt each second passing as if it were an eternity, the rapid beating of his heart seeming to explode in his ears, and his muscles tensed. He wanted to run, protest, defend himself, but he knew very well that any movement could be interpreted in the worst possible way. His mother had always warned him about moments like these, telling him that in such situations, calm and self-control could mean the difference between safety and harm. So, even with sweaty, slightly trembling hands, he remained still, trying to demonstrate that he posed no threat. Minutes later, the glass doors abruptly opened, and two police officers entered the store with quick, decisive steps. The first, older with a thick mustache, was Sergeant Blake, a veteran known for his rigid and authoritarian demeanor. Right behind him was Officer Doyle, younger and with a more hesitant expression, as if something about the scene disturbed him. Blake advanced directly toward Jaylen, his hand already resting near his handcuffs, and ordered in a harsh, intimidating voice, "Hands where I can see them! Now!" Doyle observed the scene with a cautious look, glancing briefly at Margaret and the other customers, gradually realizing that something was very wrong in that situation. Even so, he followed standard procedure, taking position next to his colleague while Jaylen, slowly and with clearly peaceful movements, raised his trembling hands to show that he was fully cooperating. Jaylen felt powerless in the face of that absurd situation. Everything seemed like a nightmare from which he couldn't wake up. Injustice tightened around his chest, and his face burned with a painful mix of shame and anger. Seeing that the officers were unwilling to listen, he remembered the advice his mother always repeated: "If you're in danger, call me immediately." Taking a deep breath, he swallowed his indignation and said in a voice trying to remain steady, "Please, let me call my mom before anything else. You need to hear her first." Margaret let out a sarcastic laugh from behind the counter, but Doyle, noticing the sincerity in Jaylen's eyes, nodded discreetly in agreement. Under Blake's critical gaze, Jaylen slowly picked up his cell phone, quickly dialed the number he had memorized since childhood, and waited for his mother to answer. A few minutes later, while everyone remained still, trapped in that charged, tense atmosphere, the jewelry store doors opened again with a firm, decisive bang. At that very moment, all eyes converged on the imposing figure striding through the space with determined, authoritative steps. It was Simone Carter, Jaylen's mother, and the chief of police of Riverton. Simone had a naturally commanding presence, always dressed elegantly yet practically, with short, voluminous hair that accentuated her expressive, piercing eyes. Upon entering, she quickly assessed the entire situation with a single glance. Her son, with his hands raised, the police officers in hostile positions, and Margaret Whitmore behind the counter, still clutching the phone like a useless shield. Without hesitation, Simone pulled out her badge, holding it high enough for everyone to see clearly, and demanded in a firm yet calm tone, "Can someone please explain exactly what is happening here?" At that moment, an awkward silence dominated the jewelry store. Blake, noticing the evident authority in Simone's voice, discreetly took a step back, although he tried to maintain his rigid, intimidating posture. Doyle gave the sergeant an apprehensive look, clearly realizing that they had made a big mistake. Margaret Whitmore, who just seconds before had exuded complete confidence and disdain toward Jaylen, now nervously bit her lower lip, continuously adjusting her golden glasses on her nose. Simone calmly advanced to her son, placed a protective hand on his shoulder, and repeated the question firmly. "I'll ask one more time. Can someone here explain why my son is being treated like a criminal in this store?" Margaret tried to maintain her air of superiority, stuttering as she pointed at Jaylen with trembling fingers. "He dropped an expensive bracelet. It looked like he was trying to steal it. I was just protecting the store." Her voice failed miserably, as Simone's impassive expression showed no empathy for her words. Simone stared at her in silence for several seconds that seemed to last an eternity. With a calmness that only heightened the tension in the room, she looked directly at Sergeant Blake and firmly requested, "I would like you to immediately check the security camera footage. My son has never had to steal anything in his life, and I guarantee he did nothing wrong today." Blake hesitated for a moment, clearly disconcerted, but nodded quickly, slowly walking toward the counter where the store's monitors were located. Clearing his throat, Blake tried to regain some authority after the public humiliation he had just endured. "Well, it seems there was a misunderstanding," he began, his voice laden with evident discomfort, but Simone raised one of her hands, interrupting him before he could offer any empty excuse. "A misunderstanding," she repeated, her tone calm but as sharp as a blade. "You all came in here already decided who was at fault. You didn't ask any questions, didn't analyze the facts, didn't consider any possibility other than the narrative created by this woman." Margaret shrank behind the counter, her eyes fixed on the floor, unable to meet Simone's or Jaylen's gaze. The weight of the truth was now inescapable, but even so, she did not seem willing to admit her mistake. Jaylen watched everything in silence, his heart still pounding, but now for a different reason. It was no longer fear, but frustration. Even in the face of irrefutable evidence, he knew that Margaret would never apologize. People like her rarely admitted being wrong. Doyle stepped forward, his expression dejected. I should have questioned before acting," he said, his voice laden with sincere regret. "I'm sorry, kid. It was something, but not enough to erase what had happened." Jaylen merely nodded, unwilling to say anything. What could he say? An apology didn't change the fact that minutes earlier he could have been handcuffed or worse. Simone crossed her arms and looked directly at Blake. "And you, Sergeant, are you going to say something or pretend like this never happened?" Blake gritted his teeth, uncomfortable, but remained silent. His silence spoke louder than any excuse he could offer. Simone let out a slow sigh, containing the frustration that threatened to overflow. She knew all too well that kind of silence, the silence of those who, even when caught in error, refused to acknowledge their faults. Her eyes turned back to Margaret, who was still hiding behind the counter, her rigid posture betraying her discomfort. "And what about you?" Simone asked, her voice unhurried but carrying an inescapable weight. "You were sure enough to call the police and accuse an innocent young man, but now it seems you've lost your words." Margaret finally lifted her head, and for a brief moment, something resembling remorse shone in her eyes, but it disappeared as quickly as it had appeared. "I was only protecting the store," she murmured, her voice sounding more like an excuse to herself than a real answer. Jaylen felt a knot tighten in his throat. Even there, in the face of evidence, in the face of the unvarnished truth, Margaret refused to simply admit that she had judged him by the color of his skin above all else. It didn't matter that he had worked hard to buy that gift. that he had entered the store with respect and courtesy. In her eyes, none of that mattered. He had already been condemned the moment he walked through those doors, and that was what hurt the most. He swallowed hard, diverting his gaze to his mother, who now watched him with a gleam of sadness in her eyes. "Let's go, Mom," he said, his voice low yet firm. He didn't want to stay there another second. Simone hesitated for a moment, looking around as if she wanted to ensure that everyone in the store knew that this would not end here. Then she nodded, placing a firm hand on her son's shoulder before they turned and slowly walked toward the exit. When Jalen and Simone reached the door, a heavy, uncomfortable silence hung in the air, as if everyone in the store were holding their breath. Deep down, no one wanted to face what had just happened. For them, it was easier to let the situation fade into oblivion, like so many others before it. But Simone would not let that happen. Before leaving, she turned one last time to the officers and in a controlled yet authoritative tone said, "This will not stand. I will take the necessary measures to ensure that something like this never happens again, and that those responsible face the consequences." Blake looked away, his jaw tense. Doyle lowered his head, visibly remorseful. And Margaret? She remained motionless, her lips pressed together without uttering a single word. Her pride was still stronger than any sense of justice. The afternoon sun enveloped them as soon as they stepped outside, and Jalen let out a long sigh, as if releasing all the weight he had carried in those last few minutes. But the truth was that the weight remained. It wasn't something that simply dissipated upon leaving the store. What had happened inside was a reflection of something much larger, something he knew he would face for the rest of his life. Simone, noticing the whirlwind of emotions on her son's face, stopped beside him and softly said, "You did everything right, Jalen. Everything." He looked at her, seeking some sort of comfort, but all he managed to say was, "Even so, it wasn't enough." Simone didn't answer immediately. She just nodded, as if she understood the depth of those words, because deep down she did, more than anyone. Jalen's steps were heavy as he and his mother walked silently to the car. The cold afternoon wind seemed even sharper against his skin, as if the world around him were trying to cool the anger and disappointment burning inside him. He still felt the stares of those people in the store, the expressions of judgment, the disdain disguised as concern. It was a kind of weight that was hard to describe, but impossible to ignore. When they reached the vehicle, Simone unlocked the doors with a click and stopped before getting in. "Jalen," she called, her voice low but firm. He stopped, closing his eyes for a moment before turning to her. "This does not define you," she said, holding his gaze. "What happened in there was wrong, but it doesn't say who you are." Jalen wanted to answer with a simple yes, to show that he understood, that those words made sense. But the truth was that a part of him wasn't sure. Because, as much as he knew he was innocent, that he had done everything the right way, the end result was the same. He had been treated like a criminal for nothing more than a silent, yet deadly, prejudice. Instead of replying, he lowered his eyes, staring at the distorted reflection in the car window. Simone sighed and opened the driver's door, making room for him to get in as well. "Let's go home," she said softly. "We'll talk more later." Jalen nodded and slid into the car, feeling his stomach heavy, because deep down he knew that this wasn't just a bad moment. It was a reminder of a reality he would never have the luxury of forgetting. The drive home was spent in silence. Simone drove with steady hands on the wheel, her gaze fixed on the road, but Jalen knew his mind was racing. He himself watched the scenery rush by the window, trying to organize his thoughts. He felt the knot in his throat tighten with every recollection of what had happened. The feeling of powerlessness, of being judged before he could prove anything, of being treated like an intruder in a place where he only wanted to buy a gift for his sister. It was unjust, infuriating, but what truly gnawed at him was the certainty that this was not an isolated case. It happened every day, everywhere, and most of the time, without a security camera or a powerful enough mother to intervene. When they finally arrived home, Simone turned off the engine and faced her son before he got out of the car. "Do you want to talk now, or would you prefer some time to yourself?" Her voice wasn't forced or laden with moral lessons, just an invitation for him to decide what he needed at that moment. Jalen took a deep breath, exhaling slowly. I need a minute," he replied, opening the door and stepping out before his mother could insist further. He walked to the porch, feeling the weight of the entire day on his shoulders. The air outside was cooler, but it couldn't stop his mind from spinning. He wanted to understand how something as simple as buying a gift had turned into a cruel reminder that, to some people, he would never be just any kid. No matter how much he studied, worked, or was respectful, there would always be someone ready to see him as a threat. Jalen sat on the steps of the porch, resting his elbows on his knees as he rubbed his hands over his face, trying to dissipate the frustration. Inside the house, he could hear his mother's footsteps heading to the kitchen, probably giving him the space he asked for. But deep down, he knew that she, too, needed a moment to process everything. Despite all her authority as police chief, Simone was still a mother who had just seen her son treated like a criminal for nothing more than prejudice deeply ingrained in society. Jalen wondered how many times she had faced this alone before he was old enough to notice. The sound of his phone vibrating in his pocket pulled him from his thoughts. He picked up the device and saw his sister's name on the screen. For a second, he hesitated. He didn't want Aaliyah to notice his tense voice. He didn't want that awful day to affect her joy. But then he remembered why he had entered that store in the first place. Taking a deep breath, he answered. "Hi, Shorty," he said, forcing a light tone. On the other end, Aaliyah responded excitedly, talking non-stop about her upcoming birthday, the balloons she wanted, and the cake she had already chosen. As he listened, Jalen closed his eyes and smiled faintly. At least for a few minutes he could cling to that genuine happiness of his sister, a reminder that not everything in the world was bitter. When the conversation with Aaliyah ended, Jalen felt a small relief, as if her lightness had been transmitted to him, even if only for a few minutes. He got up from the porch and went back inside, finding Simone in the living room with a serious yet calm expression. She was seated on the sofa, arms crossed, as if waiting for a conversation. Jalen hesitated before approaching her, but when he saw her, he realized just how much she was rooting for him to understand everything that was happening. Simone didn't need words to show her support. When he sat beside her, she placed her hand on his shoulder and remained silent for a moment. The silence between them spoke louder than any speech ever could. "Mom," Jalen finally said in a hoarse voice, "do you think this will change anything?" Simone looked into his eyes, feeling the pain behind those words. "I don't know, son," she replied sincerely. "But what I can tell you is that what you did today was not in vain. Every time we stand up and fight, even if it seems small, we are making a difference." She hugged him, and for a moment, Jalen felt that despite everything, there was something bigger and stronger than the difficulties he would face. The struggle, the resistance, and the hope. The following days were filled with a persistent sense of unease. Jalen couldn't forget what had happened in the store, but his mother's support and his sister's comfort helped him move forward, even though the pain of the experience was still fresh in his mind. Simone, as always, was firm and determined. She initiated an internal investigation into the behavior of the officers, while also organizing a meeting with the people in charge at Belmont Jewelers to ensure that the incident was taken seriously. The store's response came quickly, but not in the way Jalen had expected. Although they acknowledged Margaret's error, the apologies were vague and unsatisfactory. There was no mention of any real measures to address the prejudice within their establishment. Simone, however, was not content with that. She used her position to ensure that the scandal was widely publicized. Within a few days, the story about what had happened in the store made local news and spread across social media. The criticisms were harsh, and public support for Jaylen was massive. Belmont Jewelers saw its reputation plummet, with sales dropping and online reviews skyrocketing into the negative. Margaret was placed on leave, and rumors began to circulate that she might be fired. Jaylen knew that things were changing, but still, the feeling that all of this could be quickly forgotten bothered him. He couldn't shake the feeling that, no matter how much the world saw the truth, it didn't mean that justice would actually be served. Time passed, and Jaylen's life continued, but the mark left by that experience at the jewelry store never completely disappeared. He returned to school, resumed his work routine at the cafe, and continued dedicating himself to his studies and basketball. But something within him had changed. That day, that confrontation with injustice continued echoing in his mind, constantly reminding him of the harshness of the world and the invisible barriers he, as a young black man, would have to face. However, there was also a new flame inside him, the desire to make a difference. The feeling of powerlessness he had experienced in the store now transformed into a silent yet firm motivation to fight for justice, not only for himself, but for all those who, like him, were victims of a system that too often judged without a shred of reason. Simone, for her part, knew that although Jaylen's situation was a reflection of what many faced daily, it was also an opportunity to show her son that despite the difficulties, there was immense power in words and action. She continued to fight, not just for him, but for all the young people who were forced to carry the weight of discrimination without ever having the chance to prove their innocence. The work was far from over. She knew that. But when she looked at Jaylen, she saw someone who, even in the face of pain, rose with renewed strength. And that to her was more valuable than any temporary victory she could achieve. She also knew that no matter how many mistakes were corrected, the lessons learned would become powerful fuel for the struggles to come. And this time, she would have her son by her side in the battle. Jaylen's fight, however, was not limited to that specific moment. That incident at the jewelry store had become a symbol for him. He knew that throughout his life, he would have to fight much more, face much more, and stand firm in the face of even greater challenges. But he also knew he was not alone. The pain and anger he felt that day were transformed into something stronger, a commitment to change, to the pursuit of justice and equality. He began to get more involved in discussions about prejudice and discrimination at school, trying to educate his peers and friends about the challenges that young black people face every day. At home, Simone continued to support him, and together they started working on community projects, aiming to ensure that future generations of young black people would not have to face the same barriers. When Aaliyah's birthday arrived, Jaylen still thought about that bracelet. It never became his sister's gift, but somehow that gesture of wanting to do something special for her was the starting point for something bigger. He remembered the joy on Aaliyah's face when she received her presents, and how, despite everything that had happened, his sister still managed to light up the day with a genuine smile. In the end, Jaylen understood that the fight for justice wasn't just about correcting past wrongs, but also about ensuring that those small moments of happiness and love continued to be possible, even in a world where injustice still had ample room to exist. He knew that alongside his mother and with the community's support, they would be ready to face anything. As the days went by, Jaylen began to understand that the real struggle wouldn't be something resolved all at once, but a continuous process. He realized that true change would come when each person began to see the humanity in the other, without judgments based on appearance or assumptions. He had already been a victim of prejudice, but he also knew that he could be part of the solution, helping to build a future in which the next generations wouldn't have to bear the weight that he and so many others had carried before them. It wouldn't be easy, but Jaylen was ready to keep going. He constantly remembered Aaliyah's smile, the pride in her eyes when she hugged him, and how she made the world seem lighter, even in the heaviest of hours. His mother, Simone, also continued on her journey of transformation, now with a new understanding of the impact she could have. As the police chief and as a mother, she knew that true change would come through education, awareness, and above all, the courage to confront challenges head-on. She and Jaylen were more united than ever, and the bond between them grew even stronger after that day at the jewelry store. Their struggle, although it often felt like a burden, was also a reminder that change wouldn't come on its own. They needed to keep rising, supporting one another, and most importantly, never give up. And as Jaylen looked toward the future, he knew that he had done his part in that moment, but that the journey was just beginning.